Welcome, viewers. My name is Karen Athanas, and I am the Executive Director of the TIC Council Americas. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we welcome Jeffrey Weiss, Partner and Co-Lead of the International Trade Policy and Negotiations at Steptoe & Johnson, LLP, and Dr. John Spicer, Managing Consultant at Europe Economics. We've invited Jeffrey and John here today to talk about a recently published report entitled The Value of the Testing, Inspection, and Certification Sector. The TIC Council commissioned the report with the aim to determine the scale and scope of activities performed by the TIC sector. John and Jeff, to begin, could you tell us a bit about the study? What question were you trying to answer in pursuing the research, and why should viewers be interested in the results?
The question we're answering, in a way, it comes from the title, what is the value of TIC? But how you interpret that was, in some sense, the key to the exercise. Many of these studies which look at the value of an industry will pretty quickly just focus on how many people are employed, how much revenue is being generated by an industry, maybe how many taxes are being paid. And it quickly became apparent to us that that's not, whilst that's interesting in itself, that only tells a very small part of the story. The much more interesting thing is, well, why do people care? Why are people paying for these services? And so that then led us on to thinking about what are the benefits to consumers, what are the benefits to industry, what are the benefits to governments and other NGOs around the world. And then from that, can we quantify those benefits? And so those were the three areas we were trying to do. And therefore, in some sense, your question, what's the interest of viewers? I guess almost all viewers will be captured by one or more of those categories, because everyone will be a consumer and many will either be working for firms or governments with an interest in what TIC benefits might generate for them.
Mm-hmm. For my part, I'm a trade lawyer. I worked on TBT issues for the U.S. government, and I worked on market access issues relating to standards issues for a long time. And I always looked at it from the market access perspective and how conformity assessment services help to provide market access and some of the barriers to market access that were caused by problematic conformity assessment procedures that may have raised concerns under the TBT agreement. But really exploring the benefits of conformity assessment, that really intrigued me a lot. I also think that going forward, at least speaking from the U.S. perspective, as we're looking at regulation and looking at figuring out how to quantify benefits, things like equity, distributive impacts, environmental justice, really taking a look at how you quantify these benefits. Some of them may be more difficult to quantify than others, is going to be really important and is going to be picked up by the new administration as they take another look at regulatory policy. So I think a lot of applications potentially for this study going forward.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk us through the preparation process for the study? How did you divide up the tasks required to develop the report?
I'm happy to take a first crack at that. And I mean, I think our expertise really, I think, complement each other very well in terms of John's economics background and my background in standards and conformity assessment policy. And so I'll let John talk a bit about the economic piece and understanding the marketplace. There's a big section at the end of the report that goes into the conformity assessment systems of various jurisdictions, which I was able to take the lead on based on my previous work in this area. And then also in helping to flesh out the case studies, of course, you have a wide variety of areas where the TIC sector is active. And so I was able to help look at a wide variety of potential case studies, talking to former colleagues in the U.S. government and other governments we work with, TIC service providers, standards developing bodies, companies, NGOs, associations, and others to try to get as wide a group of potential case studies as possible. Then we could then narrow in terms of the study.
Mm.
Just, to add to that, from our point of view, this was a very nice study to manage because it just divided so nicely. We had, the traditional, what's the size of this industry, what's the scope of this industry, then we had what are the benefits, and then at the end I was able to divide up. We had 3 case studies because we've been working with Jeff prior to getting to that point of what are the case studies, talking around to various parties in the industry and elsewhere, thinking about the case studies, and then it was a question of doing the quantifying work on those case studies.
So John, was it challenging to quantify the impact that TIC brings to different industries, consumers, and more? Why or why not? And how did you go about it?
I think difficult would be understating it. I think it would be impossible to quantify for the whole industry, and that was something we'd identified right from the get-go, and very much dictated why we thought, well, let's think about some case studies, because we're dealing here with a sector that touches on almost all other sectors of the economy. So short of delving into all of the whole economy, understanding what's going on there, you're never going to get close to quantifying the benefits at a global level. But in some sense, that didn't seem crucial. The final number wasn't important. The question is this sector generating much value? And the case studies that we chose were able to answer that question helpfully. And it was a question of what was practical. And the other feature when we did it is we wanted to do it largely relying on what you might call desk-based research rather than large surveys of lots of parties in a given industry.
Yeah. How did you decide upon the trends and specific case studies to include? What was the reasoning behind choosing the 3 specific case studies that you did?
Well, we were looking for a good mix of topics. I think we wanted to find topics that were in the news, and I think we also wanted to make sure that the topics we picked weren't clustered in 1 or 2 jurisdictions and would have a global applicability. So it was important to pick one case study that dealt with a UN Sustainable Development Goal, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The one we chose relating to public health. We wanted to pick one on consumer safety, and we did. And one we picked has a digital piece to it, which also I think speaks to the times. And then a digital payments case study that relates to cybersecurity. And we felt that was a really good mix. And we also there are also different SDOs in the mix as well. So we thought that was a really good mixture of different subjects that could really bring to light the value that the TIC sector brings across so many different sectors of the economy.
Jeff and John, you mentioned that there are quite a few examples for the case studies that you considered, and you had to pick 3 for the report. But could you share with us the rationale in picking the ones that you did, and what did you consider when making that decision?
Well, it was challenging. There were quite a few really fantastic examples. I think in terms of the ones maybe that we maybe wanted to go forward with but couldn't. We wanted to make sure that we had sufficient data because we weren't able to generate our own data for the scope of this particular study. I think that we wanted to make sure there was balance in terms of what jurisdictions were covered. So if there were more than one that were primarily related to one or another jurisdiction, we wanted to make sure we limited it to just one. I also think that there were quite a few where TIC services provided the basis for maintaining the integrity of voluntary labeling schemes to ensure that consumers or procurers would feel confident in that labeling scheme. And we couldn't include all of them, but we did include some discussion of them in boxes within the report.
John and Jeff, do you both feel that there is more to be said on this topic? Could you foresee a new study with the new case studies at a future date?
Certainly, I would say that there's more work here. I mean, there were constraints on what was achievable, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of attempting, this is a vast sector, trying to value everything would be a challenge. I'd have maybe a couple of comments here in terms of future work. One, avenue of attack would be, well, identify specific policy questions and then start maybe going into more detail in those areas to see what is the value that can be brought here and focus more specifically. But even if you step back and say, well, what's the general value? There are so many sectors that we didn't look at and so many different issues that we could have done. We've talked about the case studies. So, yep, there's plenty more that could be done.
Yeah, and I would say on the methodological issues, we're looking forward to hearing the reactions and the comments and discussing this further because I think we can continue to refine that as we go forward. As I mentioned before, with sort of a rethink on regulation on the U.S. side likely to happen in terms of the reg review process, but also in how the government quantifies benefits for purposes of regulation. I think it'd be really interesting once that comes out to see how this methodology could be used by at least one government in their process for developing regulations, and perhaps that could become a practice that others might use, or at least we could be talking about that in the TBT committee and other international fora like OECD and APEC. I think in terms of specific areas, climate is going to be a huge one, with the carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal from the European Commission. I think that's due to be released in July, and with companies needing to measure their embodied carbon in the life cycle of their products in several sectors, which is going to expand to multiple sectors over time. And the need to ensure that what's measurable now is measurable over time, and to certify that to the relevant authorities to make sure that, again, that there's scheme integrity and it's fair to all of the producers that need to comply with the regulations. I think climate is going to be a key area, and I'd love to do a follow-up study with case studies in that area, both to see what's been done before and also to provide a roadmap potentially for policymakers that are looking to put in place climate measures, as I assume that what we're going to see with the EU next month is just going to be the start as other countries gear up to meet their Paris commitments.
One of the case studies involves the role of TIC in developing a standard on non-sewered sanitation systems to promote public health, in which the Gates Foundation was involved. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. So one of the issues one of the major issues in global public health is the lack of access that hundreds of millions of people around the world have to clean and reliable sanitation. And this is something that the Gates Foundation has been focusing on, and many of you are probably familiar with the Reinventing the Toilet Challenge, in which the foundation has financed research at universities around the world to come up with non-sewered sanitation technology to deploy in the field in areas where people don't have access to sewer systems. And there are a lot of different technologies that could potentially be fit for purpose. And so the Gates Foundation worked with a major TIC member in terms of both developing the standard, all the different performance requirements and safety requirements, but also the testing and certification components of the standard. And that process was worked on through ISO, and there is now an ISO standard, ISO 3500, on non-sewered sanitation systems. And I think that was a really good example for us, because you didn't just have the TIC sector testing and certifying a standard after it had been developed, but you had the TIC sector actively collaborating in the development of the standard as a first point, but then second, in actually building up the network of laboratories to do the testing and certification in developing countries after the standard had been developed. Because until you have that capability, you're not able to actually deploy the standard and actually deploy technologies that meet the standard. And so that needs to be done in many different markets. And in this particular case, there's so many different components of the non-sewered sanitation system whether it's sound requirements, safety requirements, smell requirements, all kinds of different things. And there are very few organizations that have all those capabilities. So a network of providers had to be put together to do that. And the TIC sector played a huge role in putting that together as we move forward to the next stage, which is hopefully deployment of technologies consistent with the ISO standard in developing markets around the world, so we can bring that number down of persons that do not have access to clean, safe, and reliable sanitation systems, which is one of the goals of the UN in the SDGs.
Right. Innovation, sustainability, tech. These are all trends that are being heavily discussed right now. When working on the study, did you encounter any emerging trends that really stuck out as areas where the TIC sector is likely to play an increasingly important role?
Well, I think a big area will be in fulfillment of the UN SDGs. As we talked about earlier, the Gates Foundation example is meant to help with SDG 6 on clean water and public health and sanitation. And I think that's a great example of how the TIC sector, where you're normally thinking about the cost of TIC services, but here you show the value of TIC services in creating markets for products that are really important for meeting critical public policy objectives. And I think that this example could be a really good scene setter potentially for discussions at the WTO, potentially at TBT committee, about the use of the TIC sector combined with standards bodies and foundations and development banks in putting heads together and brainstorming and thinking about how can we solve other major public policy issues and help meet the UN SDGs. And I'd love to be a part of that conversation, because I think looking at what Gates has accomplished, it will be amazing to be able to do that with some of the other SDGs.
So what were the most challenging aspects to developing the report?
I think I would identify three big challenges now when I look back. I mean, one was avoiding the risk of being boring by including everything. There was lots of material we could have included, and so it was choosing what are we going to include. The second was identifying the case studies, and I think we've talked about that a little bit before. There were quite a few candidates, and so we're thinking about how do we get the right mix, and which of those case studies is likely to work, because there's an element of once you chose a case study, you were committed, and we wanted to get it right once we chose it. And then having chosen the case study, it was populating it with data in a way. We were keen not to be pestering people for lots and lots of data. We wanted to do it where possible with material that was in the public domain. And so it was making sure we had plausible data to generate plausible estimates for the purposes of this exercise.
So were you surprised by any of the findings? And maybe as a follow-up, what is the biggest takeaway for you?
Well, in many sense for myself, with relatively less experience of the sector than Jeff, I mean, one of the findings I found surprising was almost from the get-go just how huge this sector is. There were so many different angles. I don't think I conceived that I would be looking at sewerless toilets when I said I would look at what it would help assess the value of TIC. The other thing I would say that surprised me, and I think it's an important takeaway from the report, if you will, is apparently small contributions can scale up and make a big difference. So yes, the sector maybe does get things done quicker than would happen absent TIC. So standards get developed quicker and rolled out, and markets get created as a consequence. That scales and can create very large values, as our case studies demonstrated.
Yeah, and for me, I think the biggest takeaway was just how much leadership the TIC sector shows in meeting public policy goals, rather than, as we were discussing before, a lot of folks just look at it as it's at the back end, it's testing and certifying at the end. But as many of our case studies show, there's actually a huge contribution at the front end. We talked about non-sewage sanitation earlier, but connected consumer products is another great example. the TIC services in that case actually enabled the meeting of public policy goals. The Consumer Product Safety Commission actually asked for assistance from the sector in developing rules, and then that began taking shape in the ASTM committee process. And then by doing that, you're also accelerating development of an international standard that agencies can potentially adopt. And as John said, even a couple of months is going to make a huge difference in terms of the benefits, in terms of lives and injuries and other aspects. So I think that was the biggest takeaway for me.
John and Jeff, TIC activities like testing, inspection, and certification often are happening in the background. Most people are unaware of this ecosystem of conformance that exists. For those listening in, what example would you point to that best highlights this invisible role that TIC plays?
I think for me, the one that resonated with me was the role in checking chip and pin for cards, but continuing that, the role in things like passports and ID systems, where in some cases governments would be struggling absent the TIC sector to do this. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with a large, a G7 member, that may not apply, but as you get to smaller countries, there really is a big advantage in something like the TIC system, taking care of things that we take for granted and don't give a second thought to, but if that's going to become increasingly important, I would have thought going forward, is things like chips and pins in ID systems and the like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For me, when I think about the TIC sector, I always think about, I have two young kids, they're 4 and 6. We just went to the beach for the weekend, and we were using a bouncy house and an inflatable pool, and we took them to a theme park, Storybook Land, and where they're riding the rides, and so it gives me a lot of comfort knowing that everything has been tested and certified. In the case of the amusement parks, there's inspection as well to international standards. So when I think about the value of TIC, I think about my kids.
John and Jeff, thank you for joining us today and sharing your insights into the development of the recently published report, The Value of the Testing, Inspection, and Certification Sector. The report provides an in-depth look into conformity assessment and the important role it plays in society as a whole. We look forward to your future work on the topic and engaging with you as you continue to explore the TIC landscape. For those listening, the report is available for download from the TIC Council website. Please feel free to reach out with your questions or to engage with the TIC Council to continue the conversation on this important topic.